I'm Rick Thompson, President and CEO of the Cornelia Crenshaw Foundation, and I am here to interview Dr. Willie Herenton, former mayor of Memphis city government. And Dr. Herenton was an admirer, from what I understand, of Cornelia Crenshaw, as I was, and as I am, was and am. But for some reason or another, this amazing woman, Miss Cornelia Crenshaw, people are trying to write her out of history as if she did nothing before her death. And it is my responsibility, I have made it my responsibility to tell the story of Miss Cornelia Crenshaw and the work that she did predating her death. So, Dr. Herenton.
Yes.
I don't know why people are trying to write this amazing woman out of history, but I know that you were somewhat of an admirer of hers. Could you tell me how you knew Mr. Cornelia Crenshaw?
Okay.
And in what capacity?
Okay. Let me first of all commend you for really having that deep and strong sense of history with regard to the impact that Mrs. Crenshaw made on the civil rights movement. So I've observed you and your union and the foundation, and I want you to know that I am encouraging you with all of my fervor and all of my passion for those warriors who were on the front line. And Mrs. Cornelia Crenshaw, as I look back over the history of the city of Memphis, is on a short list, at least my short list, of people that demonstrated a strong sense of fighting for justice, equality, and what was right, especially for black people. Man, I can talk about Mrs. Cornelia Crenshaw for days and have nothing but the highest of accolades. Let me tell you how I know her very quickly. I was born in Memphis, 1940, in the heyday of racial segregation. I remember drinking from separate water fountains. I remember when water fountains were marked colored and white. I remember sitting on the back of the bus because of race. I remember when my mother would take me downtown, we could not try on clothes because all public accommodations were segregated. But I also remember some civil rights lawyers who were fighting for us to have the right for peaceful assembly. But moreover, I remember this dignified lady who was articulate, who was courageous, who would always be in a battle with Memphis Light, Gas, and Water Division. I would watch her on the news, and I said, what manner of a woman is this? That was Mrs. Cornelia Crenshaw. She was fighting against MLG&W for a whole lot of issues that were impacting people of color. And I don't know if you saw her then. I mean, she was always impeccably dressed, very articulate. You could just feel her fervor for justice and civil rights. You know, we just celebrated MLK 50th, and I had nothing to do with that. But if I'd had something to do with that, Mrs. Cornelia Crenshaw would have been a part of that movement, because I know you're going to talk about it later. A lot of people don't know her role in the civil rights movement here in Memphis, and I hope you and I talk about that. But I probably have talked too long, but I have a short list of people that I hold in very, very high esteem for courage, for perseverance, for tenacity, for high character, for nobility when it comes to fighting for justice and equality. And Mrs. Cornelia Crenshaw is a lady that we should never forget. So I applaud you for all of your efforts to keep her legacy alive.
Was Mr. Cornelia Crenshaw instrumental in you as an elected official, and if so, elaborate?
Well, let me give it to you a little deeper than that. Mrs. Cornelia Crenshaw contributed to my development as a person, as a man who could stand up against a power structure and to demand justice and equality. That's what Mrs. Cornelia Crenshaw. When I told you about this short list that I have of people that I respect, who were warriors, who would fight the power structure for justice and equality, so she meant more to me than motivating me. At the time I met Mrs. Crenshaw, I never thought I would have been a public official. I had no aspirations of getting into politics, but I was a man. I knew what was right and I knew what was wrong, and I'm looking at this lady, this dignified lady with strength and with courage. Man, she was fighting the white power structure. She did not back down. That helped to instill in me perseverance, tenacity, okay, character if you feel you're right. Did you know that Mrs. Crenshaw suffered some inhuman treatment? She was without utilities. Can you imagine in this day and time without utilities based on your conviction? I mean, this lady, man, was remarkably strong. So to answer your question, if I have any strength, I got some of it because I watched and I admired a lady like Mrs. Crenshaw.
If you could do something different than what you did during her era, what would you do different?
It's probably very little that I would do differently because, as you well know, as I told you, I came up in the 60s. Remember when Memphis State became desegregated, I think in 1959. I remember the buses were desegregated, the lunch counters. So I've been around a long time. I think at the time, if there had been a movement around Mrs. Crenshaw, I know I would have been there with her. But if you notice, Mrs. Crenshaw stood alone. This lady didn't have the NAACP, the SCLC. This lady stood alone. So I don't know what I would do differently unless I got out there and stood with her.
So what was the most important lesson you learned from her?
Well, I think I'm being a little redundant. I think what I know what I learned from her. I know what I learned from her. I know what I learned from Dr. Martin Luther King. I learned to persevere in the face of opposition that may not understand your cause, may not agree with you, but to be true to yourself and your God and to stand tall for what is right. I learned that. And to have strength, and to have strength, and to have tenacity, to have perseverance, stamina. I learned all of that. Do you know what Ms. Crenshaw went through for years? So that taught me the value of being courageous. And I don't want to leave this interview without talking about courage. Courage. When I look at the political and the landscape in Memphis today, what I see that's abundantly clear is a lack of courage. There's so many people that just roll over to get along, even when things are not right, but they don't have the courage to stand up on truth. And Mrs. Crenshaw taught me that irrespective of the odds against you, if you believe you're right, pray to your God and stand tall.
If Ms. Crenshaw were living today, what do you think she would be saying about the lack of courage of the current, many of them, not all, but many of the current elected officials?
If Mrs. Crenshaw were alive today, I can see this lady standing up, calling them out, pointing them out in front of that microphone and talking bad to them, but telling the truth. You know I'm telling the truth. Am I right?
Yeah, you tell
She
the
would
truth.
be standing up in front of the mic. She would be sharp. She's going to be articulate, but she would tell them exactly what she thought about them. That's Mrs. Crenshaw.
She would be calling them out.
She'd be calling them out. Right in their face. She would be talking about their back. She'd call them out.
Okay, is it true to say that some of the benefits we enjoy today can be contributed to Miss Cornelia Crenshaw? Please elaborate on that.
Of course, you know, you and I talked just a little bit earlier. What is amazing to me is how so many people in my generation and the one right before me have become oblivious to the impact that Mrs. Crenshaw had on civil rights here. There should be more people than you and the few people I talked to wanting to build a lasting memorial to this woman if they understood what she meant to the civil rights movement. So I'm amazed by that, the apathy on the part of people. You should have people saying, look, I want to donate, I want to sign petitions for the Cornelia Crenshaw Foundation and what your leadership is providing. We ought to have people lining up to join you in this effort. That's why I'm doing this interview today. I'm very, I feel proud that you've asked me to help in this particular campaign because I, like you, I believe that Mrs. Crenshaw's impact on the social, political, economic, and justice fabric of Memphis should never die. We should not allow her presence in the great city of Memphis to just vanish without having a lasting memorial for what this woman stood for.
Miss Cornelia Crenshaw can be considered the mother of the civil rights movement in Memphis. Why do you think so many people disregard that?
Well, you know, it's a mystery to me. Let me just say, and it's not original with me, how soon we forget. How soon we forget. And thank God that I can never forget from whence I've come. I can never forget what it was like. And I cannot forget the people that helped to change the social, the political, and the economic fabric of Memphis. I can't forget. But apparently, there are a lot of people that can forget. But that's why it's your responsibility and mine to make sure that we remind them.
You know, so many people don't even know the role that Miss Crenshaw played in the civil rights movement in Memphis. How do you think we need to remind them?
First of all, and you may be contemplating this, I think a documentary needs to be done on Mrs. Crenshaw. There should be plenty of, in the archives, Channel 5 was around then, and Channel 3. If you're looking even the television archives, the commercial appeal, there ought to be plenty of information on Mrs. Crenshaw. I remember seeing Mrs. Crenshaw, they were taking her out trying to arrest her. She would even say, you want to arrest me? Arrest me. She said, I have a constitutional right and I'm going to speak. I admired her. I can see her right now. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but other than to say, look, you and I have a responsibility and you're fulfilling yours. And I'm going to help in whatever way I can to make sure that her impact is a lasting one and that is indelibly imprinted in the history of Memphis. That's what you and I need to work on to get done.
So share some of your thoughts about how she impacted positively equality here in Memphis and Shelby County.
Well, here again, I probably will be redundant. That's what I've been saying. When you looked at fair housing, you know, at one particular time, I mean, that was still a big issue. Now it's affordable housing. Fair housing was a big issue back in the day. Police brutality was a problem then. The MLGNW, the whole rate system, the lack of diversity at MLGNW, you know, and even some of the treatments that people, just the average day worker and conditions that people were facing in those times. So I think in just about every aspect of life in a city like, especially a southern city like Memphis, SCLC, I forgot to tell you about that. Even in the old days, NAACP, SCLC, Mrs. Crenshaw was before SCLC came to Memphis. Did you know that?
Mm-mm.
Oh yes, absolutely.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So, you know, when you've been around as long as I, you remember the movers and shakers, and certainly this courageous woman is one that made Memphis a better city. That's Miss Cornelia Crenshaw.
The only thing I hate I didn't do is, you know, I hung with got with Mr. Crenshaw in the late 80s.
Yeah.
And she used to tell me all the time, Rick, every time you come over to my house or talk to me, bring a recorder. See, because they're going to either kill me or I'm going to die of old age.
Yeah.
And I thought it was, you don't think nothing about that.
Yeah, right.
But if I had done that,
yeah.
Oh man, I would have all kind of information for her on her right now.
I'm going to tell you something, Rick. Mrs. Cornelia Crenshaw made some strong statements
Yes.
about some of our leaders, and I will not call their names. And I used to wonder, I said, well, why? I said, I'm a fan of Mrs. Crenshaw, but why is she speaking against those particular leaders? And I will tell you this, without calling any names, she was right. But I had to see that her admonition, her warning, her calling certain people out. I learned later in life that Mrs. Crenshaw was right on target. These people were in leadership roles, but they were playing both sides of the street, and I won't call any names.
Well, for those of you who want name calling,
But please don't call one out.
to my show. Turn to my show that comes on every Saturday.
She was right.
But and my people I call out may be different from his.
Okay.
You predates me.
Okay.
And it seems like you got a pretty good knowledge.
I got a good knowledge
What's
of
going on
Oh,
at
yes,
that
sir.
time. What methods did she use to make these changes? What methods did she have?
Well, you didn't have social media then, obviously.
That's right.
We didn't have social media. The media she used, obviously, was the electronic media, television, and the Commercial Appeal and the Press Senator were the dominant newspapers, and the Tri-State Defender was around then, and we had Memphis World was an old newspaper at that time too. Mm-hmm. So she used the printed media and electronic media whenever she availed herself of it, because she was a colorful individual. She was always, I admired her dress, and she'd have her accessories on, and she was so articulate and so polished and so forceful in her deliverance. Yeah, so.
What do you think she learned?
That's interesting. You know what, Rick? I don't know a lot about Mrs. Crenshaw's upbringing. I don't know how she learned all of that. That's something I need to research. I don't know where Mrs. Crenshaw, where she was born. I don't know how long she lived in Memphis. I don't know where she went to school. I don't know where she got all that class. I don't know much about her. You know, all I saw was her works.
She was born in Millington, but
yeah.
She was born in Millington. But when I look back at try to find back her history, I can't find
I don't know
how she came to learn all that.
She's well educated. I don't know where she went to formally educated, but she was so polished, articulate, and well dressed. That was Mrs. Crenshaw. I don't know.
So in your opinion, what was she most known for that you know?
For her courageous battles with MLGNW, the institution that you are part of today. You know, now, the Memphis Housing Authority, you know, she had some influence there as well.
Yeah, I think she was the first black manager.
That's what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
As a Memphis Housing Authority.
Mm-hmm.
So that meant she had to have some business acumen. She knew something about business, economics, and finance, and running a business, because government really is a business.
Mm-hmm.
So I really don't know if she went to college. I assume she did, because she was just so well versed. But I don't know.
You know, she used to say about Memphis like gas and water. She used to say that one day the credit line was going to be longer than the pay line. And so that's why she fought MLDW to force them to start allowing partial payments.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So where do you think she get that insight from? Because if you go to MLDW now.
Rick, I think she was, Rick, here's what I think, Rick. I think Miss Cornelia Crenshaw was well educated, whether it was formal education or not. She was above the crowd. Typically leaders are above the crowd. She stood out above the crowd. I mean, she stood out in a lot of positive ways, and probably her background enabled her to have the insights that she had about MLG&W and making it more accommodating to poor people. I think she had the intelligence and the education to see what needed to be done, but moreover, she had the courage to force it.
I think what drew Miss Crenshaw to me is I worked at MLGW.
Of course.
They said I was a radical at that time. I would tell. I took it that I was telling the truth.
Yes, sir.
But they said I was a radical.
Yeah.
And when I asked her to speak at one of our events, she saw MLGW on there, because the organization was Minority Coalition of MLGW. I think MLGW is what drew her to me. Yeah. But anyway, how important is it for us to impart the life and legacy of Cornelia Crenshaw in future generations, and why?
Well, I think, Rick, I've already addressed that. I think when you look at the civil rights movement here in Memphis, if her role is not clearly articulated in that history, it should be, okay? So I think those of us who recognize the role that she played in the civil rights movement, the spark, she was part of the spark that led us through I Am a Man and all of that. Historians must capture that. What you're doing, developing the documentary, will help to convey this to the next generation, okay? The other thing of it is, and to my knowledge, Rick, the Cornelia Crenshaw Foundation and your union leadership represents the only movement toward making sure that her memory, her deeds are recorded in history. Yeah. So I don't know how we're just going to get this across to people. We got to keep pushing.
Keep pushing.
You got to keep pushing.
Okay. Name some ways Memphis City official can pay homage to Miss Cornelia Crenshaw.
Well, first of all, Rick, and let me just say this, because this is a non-political interview with me. Right. So I want you to know this is not political. Right. What I'm stating about Mrs. Crenshaw, it comes from my heart, okay? I admired the lady. I respected her for her courage, her sense of fighting for those that were at the bottom, okay? Now, to answer your question about political leaders, I think if they look back at this later, just embrace what she stood for. Emulate the traits that she had. If the elected officials had the courage of conviction that Mrs. Crenshaw had the tenacity to fight, okay? Had the perseverance to hang in there, even when the odds were against you, then Memphis would be a better city with strong leadership. That's what she left with me.
Did you know that the house that Miss Cornelia Crenshaw stayed in on Vance have been demolished It's almost like she never even existed over there.
No, I didn't know that.
The house is totally demolished.
Is there land there? Is there a lot there? Do you know? Or who owns it?
Well, it's a lot there. You know, I guess the lot is still there.
Yeah, but I mean
around, you know, the church bought it.
Oh, so a church bought. I got you. Okay.
And it's almost like if you didn't see the 2 water meter boxes
You
out
would-
there, you wouldn't even know.
You wouldn't
she
even. I got you. I understand.
So,
Yeah.
if money was not an issue, tell me how you would commemorate Cornelia Crenshaw.
Well, first of all, I truly believe, and I'm not one who believes in a lot of statues, even though my college devoted a statue to me, Lemoyne Owen College, of which I'm grateful. But I would say that we have statues of a number of people that have played key roles in the development of Memphis. It would seem to me that one consideration would be, as part of the civil rights movement, that a statue, okay? There's no reason why a building of great prominence with the right message, there's no reason to me why we couldn't name a building after Mrs. Crenshaw. They've been naming buildings after a whole lot of people that have not had the impact on Memphis that Mrs. Crenshaw's had. That's just a few ideas. I think they also, in the local history of Memphis, when they come up with all of these pictures of people, in our own newspaper, the Tri-State Defender, I'm not just pointing that one particular paper out, but every February when we do Black History, we ought to have Mrs. Cornelia Crenshaw featured. I mean, this is just Willie Herenton talking,
Right.
but hopefully those are just some suggestions.
You know, what's your thought or opinion on the Cornelia Crenshaw Foundation have been trying to push for a small museum of Cornelia Crenshaw and trying to get the city council to change the name of Van Street to Cornelia Crenshaw Boulevard. What do you think about that?
Well, let me tell you something. I don't even know why it would be difficult to not have a street, particularly in that area, named after Mrs. Crenshaw. I don't understand the difficulty of that.
And the thing
Yeah.
is
I really don't. I mean, it's once you know the history, why not? Do you know they're naming streets? In fact, people say, well, they don't have a street named after you. I said, I tell you what, while I'm alive, don't name anything after me. When I'm dead, hell, I can't control it. But I don't necessarily want anybody to name the street after me, because now they name streets after anybody.
Well, I sent a letter to the city council and the mayor.
Yeah.
And I don't want to make this political, but ask them to name Van Street to Cornelia Crenshaw Boulevard. And of course, I did get a letter back. Insulting, really. But also asked them to create a small museum on Van Street called the Cornelia Crenshaw Museum.
Mm-hmm.
Because with all the things, all the original stuff would go in there. I make sure of that.
Oh, Rick, let me just say, Rick, if they don't want to, if they don't want to make a museum, the civil rights, and I don't know why we never thought about this. We have a National Civil Rights Museum. Did any historian or any curator research the role that Mrs. Crenshaw played in the civil rights movement? Now, they may have something in that Civil Rights Museum about Mrs. Crenshaw. I don't remember. You probably know more about that than I do. Is there?
I think it's a word here or there. They put in there lately, but
Yeah.
the reason I hadn't gone that way is because if you go and get all the archives of Miss Crenshaw, you'll see that she was so against that museum until
I got it.
maybe she would turn over in her grave.
Oh, well, so, okay. Well, you just answered my question about it. We cannot do that. No, we wouldn't want to do anything
Because
that,
she the one that called the museum.
I remember.
I was there when she did this.
Yeah.
She called the museum and told the museum, she said, look here, my Lincoln Continental is over at Hastings Sun Body Shop. Dr. King rode in that car
right,
when he was here. Every time he came to Memphis, he
Yeah.
drove that Lincoln Continental.
absolutely right.
You can have it. You can have the original car in the yard. And they said, no, thank you.
I got
I
you.
was sitting there when she did it.
I'm glad you mentioned, what I didn't want to tell you, when I talked about her being a lady of class, I knew she drove a car like that. She had fur coats. Are you following? I'm just letting you know, I didn't want to get it off,
Yep.
but when I mentioned
Oh, she
Mrs.
had
Crenshaw was a lady of class distinction, you could look at her and you could tell she was above the crowd. Really,
She stood out.
she stood out. She stood out.
She stood out. I said, if she was here today with us, what would you say to her?
Rick, I probably would say, Mrs. Crenshaw, you and I, she would have been a little older. Yeah, she's a little older. If she'd been alive today, I don't know what her age, obviously you know my age.
If she was here today, she'd be about 103.
She'd be 103. If her faculties were still strong, I would remind her of the struggles of the past and look at where we are today with this generation that did not appreciate the shoulders upon which they stood on and have not pledged to carry on what many of us fought for. We know it's a new era, it's a new century, but injustices, inequalities are still prevalent, and you still need the strong civil rights fighting people that we had in the 60s, in the 70s, and the 80s. Here's what I think Mrs. Crenshaw and I would talk about. This generation today has become so materialistic. They are right now generation.
Mm-hmm.
They think everything is all right when it's not all right. They have forgotten the have-nots. I think Mrs. Crenshaw and I would have a discussion about that. And leadership is almost non-existent. The type that Mrs. Crenshaw stood for, and hopefully the type that I stand for today. I think Mrs. Crenshaw and I would have had some interesting conversations about that.
And my last question is, why do you think the power to be in Memphis chooses to write such a strong black woman as Miss Crenshaw out of history?
Well, I'm not sure, Rick, if it's because of lack of consciousness of the contributions that this strong woman made, or is because of resentment for what she stood for. Are you following me? Mm-hmm. It's either one of those, or both, or it could be both. I think that's what it is. And sometimes strong leaders have to bear the burden of being strong. Mm-hmm. The weak, the meek will reject the strong.
Mm-hmm. You know, this phrase, I am a woman.
Yes.
Which I got on Miss Crenshaw.
I got you.
You know, I went and trademarked that phrase, I am a woman. That's going to be Miss Crenshaw's phrase.
I got you.
I am a woman.
I got you.
And trademark Cornelia Crenshaw, the mother of the civil rights movement in the 60s, 70s, and the 80s. Translate. They haven't. Well, I haven't sent it off, but they haven't traded. They haven't,
I got you right.
They haven't registered yet. But I'm trying to do everything I can do for Miss Crenshaw now, and I'm bringing up young people in their 20s and early 30s. We meet and discuss Miss Cornelia Crenshaw, so that long after I'm passed off the scene,
yes,
hopefully they'll do the same that I'm doing to them.
Right.
They'll bring young people in, and we can keep Miss Cornelia Crenshaw legacy alive. I intend to do it for as long as I breathe
Right.
or
Right.
live or in good health. And I really do appreciate you giving me this interview.
Well, Rick, let me again applaud you, man. The Cornelia Crenshaw Foundation for your vigorous campaign to keep this legacy alive. Thank you.
And where I got this name from, it's really called the Cornelia Crenshaw Human Rights Preservation Foundation. That's the name of it.
That's it, okay.
But before she died, she had an organization called Cornelia Crenshaw Human Rights Preservation Center.
She did, okay.
I just changed the name
I
from
got
Center
you.
to Foundation.
Yeah.
So it's really an organization that she had that I'm patterning after her.
I got you, Rick.
So-
Okay.
So once we come up with this museum, and I think we're gonna get it sooner or later, we're gonna get it.
Yes, sir.
When we in that museum, it's gonna be her original stuff.
Yes, sir. I understand.
If you know what I mean.
I know exactly what you
So-
mean. She had a lot of stuff.
So like I said, I
Okay,
appreciate you,
Rick.
Dr. Herenton.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
So I see you on the campaign trail.
Yes, sir.
All
Thank you very much.